They told the French to flee Mali. That jihadists had sealed off the capital. That chaos was swallowing the country. That Africa was falling, again. But then, no one ran. Not the Malians. Not even the French. Why? What did they see, that Paris didn't want them to? That same week, 400 kilometers north, armed columns stormed the Soumpi outpost. Kamikaze drones. Dozens of motorcycles. It was supposed to be over in minutes. But the trap snapped shut. 92 jihadists gone. A failed ambush. A forgotten battlefield. A silence too loud to ignore. And while Western media spun stories of blockades and fear, Niger's president said it plain. The invasion isn't coming from the Sahel. It's landing, in Benin. What is happening across West Africa? Who is drawing these invisible lines, and who dares to erase them? Because this is no longer about borders. It's about who stands, and who kneels. If you feel something shifting, stay with us. Subscribe. This story is far from over. It happened near the village of Soumpi, in central Mali. A combined force of JNIM fighters and Tuareg separatists launched a surprise assault on a military outpost. They deployed kamikaze drones, motorbike units, and heavy fire. But Mali's troops held the line, and turned the ambush into a rout. 92 jihadists killed. Vehicles seized. At the same time, Niger's president, Abdourahmane Tiani, accused France of secretly repositioning forces inside Benin. He pointed to a French amphibious warship docked in Cotonou. And troops spotted in the Pendjari region. The claim was bold, and largely ignored by the West. But on the ground, a different war is unfolding. And the battle for Soumpi was just the opening shot. They didn't come through the main road. That was the first sign. The jihadist coalition, composed of fighters from JNIM and armed Tuareg groups, had studied this target well. They knew the checkpoints. They knew the terrain. They wanted to slip in undetected, strike hard, and vanish into the dunes before dawn. But Soumpi was waiting. The Malian army had intercepted signals, chatter bouncing between units across the northern corridor. The base went dark. Radio silence. No movements. They let the silence speak for them. And when the engines came roaring from the east, the defenders were already dug in. It began with drones. 15 kamikaze units, small and fast, launched from hidden coordinates in the dunes. Some carried fragmentation charges. Others just impact tips, meant to disorient, not destroy. But Mali's electronic warfare team had been drilling for months. Half the drones never made it to target. 4 were jammed mid-air. 3 were blown out with improvised buckshot rounds. The rest? They hit sandbags. And then came the motorcycles. Dozens of them, kicking up plumes of dust as they weaved in from multiple angles. They didn't come to surround the base. They came to rush it. Close quarters. Fast. Brutal. The jihadists assumed the outpost was lightly manned. They assumed wrong. Because the soldiers at Soumpi were ready to die that night. They didn't fall back. They didn't call for air support. They fought, 50 meters, 20 meters, then hand-to-hand behind the perimeter wall. It lasted 90 minutes. 92 enemy fighters were neutralized. 23 motorcycles seized. 2 pickup trucks captured intact. There were no prisoners. Malian casualties were minimal, but they didn't celebrate. Not yet. Because they knew something the world still hasn't acknowledged. This wasn't just a raid. It was a rehearsal. And someone out there was watching. If you believe Africa has the right to defend itself, not just survive, but win, leave a comment below. Your voice matters more than you think. Soumpi wasn't just a base. It was a signal. On most NATO or UN mapping grids, it's barely a blip. No airport. No radar. No vital logistics. Just a hardened outpost near the central desert line. So why target it? Why now? Because it sits at the intersection of multiple invisible lines. South of the Tuareg zone. East of the Jihadist highway that leads toward Gao. West of the Nigerian border where foreign eyes have begun to settle. Taking Soumpi would have meant control, not of territory, but of narrative. It would have said, Mali is exposed. The center is soft. The core is collapsing. But it didn't fall. And because it didn't fall, something else cracked instead. Videos surfaced. Quiet at first. A soldier stepping off a truck. A small crowd clapping. A dusty flag raised again. These weren't official broadcasts. They weren't propaganda. They were proof. And they spread. Across WhatsApp groups. Pan-African circles. Telegram feeds that Western media never touches. In Niamey, the reaction wasn't silence. It was fire. President Abdourahmane Tiani stepped forward and didn't speak about Soumpi. He didn't need to. He pointed south instead, to Benin. To the French amphibious ship Tonnerre docked in Cotonou. To the reported presence of troops in Pendjari National Park. He said the quiet part out loud, the real threat to the Sahel isn't coming from within. It's landing from the outside. And just like that, the battle shifted. Because if Soumpi was supposed to fall, but didn't, then perhaps other things we've been told are also false. Perhaps the siege isn't the story. Perhaps it's the smokescreen. Because what do you call a conflict where multiple jihadist factions, who supposedly fight for the same god, are actively deleting each other in the bush? What do you call it when their funding lines don't trace back to mosques, but to embassies? What do you call it when drone attacks are synchronized with media headlines? When fuel shortages in Bamako are announced the same week NATO runs logistics through Lomé? What do you call it when the same countries warning their citizens to evacuate are also deploying naval carriers one border south? Some still call it counterterrorism. Some call it containment. But in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, people have begun to call it something else entirely, recolonization by other means. And Soumpi? It was supposed to be a test. But it became a warning. Not just to the jihadists, but to the strategists behind them. The ones who plan operations with deniability. Who weaponize NGOs. Who manipulate maps. Who draw red lines with invisible ink. They saw what happened at Soumpi. They saw a garrison that didn't run. A battlefield that didn't break. A silence that refused to play along. And in that silence, something ancient returned. Not vengeance. Not even pride. But clarity. The kind that says, we know this game. We've seen it before. And this time, we're not folding. Soumpi did not change the war. But it shattered the script. And for those watching closely, it wrote a new one. They say the enemy comes from the desert. That it rides motorcycles. That it prays before it kills. That it dissolves back into the dunes when the job is done. But what if that's only half the picture? What if the real enemy doesn't ride at all, but sails? When the dust settled in Soumpi, there were no foreign press briefings. No official statements from Paris. No acknowledgements. Just silence. But a silence that didn't last long. Because as the videos of victory spread in Mali, something else was moving to the south, out of sight, but not out of reach. In Cotonou, the capital of Benin, a vessel docked under the morning haze. Gray steel. Flat deck. Helicopters folded. Flags barely visible. The Tonnerre, an amphibious assault ship of the French Navy. Designed to carry tanks, troops, drones, and war command centers. On board, according to Nigerian intelligence, were hundreds of French soldiers. And this was not the first time. 10 landings. 10 rotations. 10 so-called exercises. But exercises for what? Benin has no active war. No declared enemies. No pressing need for foreign amphibious support. So why has one of France's most advanced naval platforms been repeatedly stationed at its shores? President Tiani of Niger called it what it was.
In Tourou, in the W National Park, and in the Pendiari region, all of the forces that we expelled from our national territory, as well as across the border with the brotherly country of Chad, have ultimately ended up on Beninese territory. Just the day before yesterday, an amphibious helicopter carrier called Tonnerre docked at the autonomous port of Cotonou, which is located in West Africa. On board there were thousands of French soldiers. They'll tell you it's just an exercise. On December 7th, there was an order, and we have been following them regularly. This is their 10th landing in Cotonou. That's why. Despite the current lull, and despite the recent resumption of the initiative, we urge you to remain highly vigilant at all times, both during deployment and while in cantonment. Please stay vigilant, stay alert, and always maintain your awareness.
Not training, but positioning. Not partnership, but pressure. He said it plainly, the forces expelled from Niger and Chad didn't go home. They went to Benin. To Tourou airstrip. To the West National Park. To the Pendiari region, where the forest ends and the Sahel begins. Where borders blur. Where surveillance is easy. And access, easier. He wasn't guessing. He was pointing. But no Western outlet picked it up. No embassies responded. No analysts debated the implications on prime time. Because acknowledging the claim would mean acknowledging the strategy. And the strategy is older than this war. Destabilize. Withdraw. Re-enter. But never really leave. The military presence in Benin follows a pattern. Not of reaction, but of anticipation. French forces retreat north under political pressure, only to reappear in the south under logistical cover. Amphibious carriers instead of air bases. Training instead of deployment. Humanitarian corridors that double as intelligence corridors. It's colonial choreography, refined for the 21st century. And yet, something has changed. Because this time, someone said no. Soumpi was not just a victory, it was a refusal. A rejection of the script. And that script depends on one thing, predictability. The assumption that when foreign forces shift south, African states will remain passive. That they will accept surveillance as support. That silence equals consent. But Niger did not stay silent. Burkina Faso did not stay passive. Mali did not fold. Instead, they started mapping, not just terrain, but intent. They began to see the landings in Cotonou as what they were, forward positioning. Strategic footholds dressed up as military courtesy. The amphibious ship became a symbol. Not of protection, but of presence. And in a region long stripped of choice, presence is everything. Presence is what allowed France to launch operations across West Africa for over a decade. Presence is what justified drone strikes in northern Mali. Presence is what created the illusion of stability while infrastructure crumbled. And now, presence is returning, not with flags, but with fog. Not with declarations, but with docking codes. This is not speculation. It's coordination. The same week the Tonnerre arrived in Benin, France issued a warning to its citizens in Mali. Jihadist blockade, they called it. Urging 4,300 nationals to evacuate. Panic by policy. Narrative by design. Create the fear. Then offer the cure. But this time, it didn't land. French citizens in Bamako spoke up. Recorded videos. Called it propaganda. Said they felt safe, secure, and had no intention of leaving. Their message was simple: we see through the game. And that is what frightens the architects of this war more than any rifle. Not resistance, but recognition. Recognition that the war is not just fought with bullets, but with stories. That terrorism can be a label applied selectively. That drone footage can omit what satellite images cannot. That an amphibious warship can carry supplies, or soldiers, depending on which direction it faces. Recognition that the battlefield is not only in Soumpi, but in ports, forests, airstrips, embassies, and press rooms. That control isn't just about land, it's about who gets to define the emergency. Name the threat, and choose when the war begins, and for whom it never ends. Benin, in this equation, becomes more than a neighbor. It becomes a pivot. A launch pad. A point on the chessboard that was never supposed to be seen. But it is seen now. And that changes everything. Because once seen, it cannot be unseen. Once named, it must be answered. And that answer, increasingly, is no. No to silent landings. No to ghost bases. No to warships disguised as allies. No to exercises without end. No to a war map where African lives are used to justify European moves. The people of the Sahel are not blind. They are not naive. They know what a warship is. They know what a pattern looks like. They know that when the desert grows quiet, and the forest begins to hum, something is coming. And this time, they intend to meet it not with submission, but with clarity. Because the new war in the Sahel is not just about defending borders. It's about exposing blueprints. And once those blueprints are exposed, the empire has no place to hide. They still call it terrorism. As if it were a single thing. As if JNIM, ASGS, and all their splinter groups marched under one flag, with one purpose, in one direction. But anyone who's watched this war from the inside knows better. There is no one war in the Sahel. There are many, layered, intersecting, contradictory. And the deadliest ones don't happen between governments and militants. They happen between militants and their own funders. JNIM, Jama'at Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin, claims to fight for Islam. That's the message. That's the cloak. But beneath it lies a tangle of loyalties so complex, even its fighters no longer know who they serve. 1 month they answer to Al-Qaeda's high command. The next, they cut deals with local militias. The next, they clash with ISGS, not over doctrine, but over territory. Because in this war, theology is the mask. Control is the motive. The foot soldiers are often genuine. Young. Angry. Poor. They believe they're fighting for God. For justice. For some imagined future. But those who lead them, those who channel their rage, have other interests. They attend secret meetings. They receive briefcases, not sermons. They report, quietly, to handlers who sit far from the front lines. In capitals. In embassies. In boardrooms. These handlers don't care who wins. They care who controls. Who disrupts. Who destabilizes enough to justify a foreign footprint, a contract extension. A new flow of aid. They finance multiple factions. Sometimes opposing ones. They watch them bleed each other dry, then offer peacekeeping support to the survivors. It's not chaos. It's choreography. That's why JNIM fighters are sometimes warned before raids. Why their camps mysteriously move hours before drone strike. Why some convoys are never stopped. Why some disappearances are never investigated. Because some actors in this war are meant to lose slowly, but never disappear. Their survival is useful. Their violence is valuable. This is not theory. Its pattern. Look at the clashes between JNIM and ISGS. Ostensibly, they are rivals. One linked to Al-Qaeda. The other to ISIS. But both claim to fight for the same religion. Both operate in the same forests. Both seek control of the same supply routes. So why do they fight each other more than they fight African states? Why do they sometimes exchange territory without combat? Why do they broadcast beheadings, not as terror, but as messaging? Because they are not just fighting for territory. They are auditioning, competing, signaling loyalty to sponsors, proving operational strength to funders whose approval means survival. The more brutal the performance, the more secure the lifeline. And those funders? They don't wear turbans. They wear suits. They sit in places that claim to be neutral. They issue statements of concern while greenlighting backdoor transfers. They denounce the violence while ensuring the companies that profit from the instability. They condemn attacks in public while discussing resource rights in private. Uranium. Lithium. Gold. Control the chaos, and you control the contract. This is the logic of modern proxy war. It doesn't declare itself. It doesn't wear flags. It moves in whispers. It lives in deniability. And JNIM is its most adaptable instrument. If you're starting to see the outlines behind the smoke, if you believe Africa has the right to name its own enemies, not just inherit them, let your voice be part of this. Comment. Share. Speak. Your clarity is resistance. In some regions, they are executioners. In others, they're negotiators. They offer protection. They tax movement. They resolve disputes. They mimic the functions of a state, in the absence of one. And then, when the time is right, they ignite again. And every time they do, the same headlines appear: Mali destabilized. Burkina Faso under siege. Niger on the brink. And with those headlines come the justifications. For troops. For airstrikes. For foreign presence. For debt. For dependency. It's a trap. But one that's been disguised as security. And Soumpi made the trap visible. Because when a garrison stands its ground, without NATO, without foreign command, and wins, the illusion breaks. If Mali can defend itself, why does it need foreign bases? If Sahelian soldiers can defeat a jihadist assault, why does France need an amphibious carrier in Benin? If people begin asking these questions, the whole structure begins to wobble. That is why the battle in Soumpi, though small on the map, was seismic in meaning. Because it interrupted the choreography. It broke the pattern. It showed that the war is not just between soldiers and jihadists. It is between narratives. Between those who need Africa weak, and those who dare to believe it strong. And JNIM? It is not a cause. It is a currency. Traded. Redirected. Kept alive not by faith, but by fear. Fear that if peace ever truly comes, some empires will have nowhere left to stand. That fear is now cracking. Because from Soumpi to Barabal, from Bamako to Niamey, a new rhythm is rising. One not set by Paris. Not by Washington. But by the people who live, fight, and die on this land. And the men who fund the chaos, they're beginning to hear it too. They thought silence was weakness. That when Mali didn't respond to the accusations, it was because it couldn't. That when Goita said nothing about the fuel crisis, or the French warning, or the so-called blockade, it meant paralysis. But in war, silence is not absence. It's positioning. When France told its citizens to flee Mali, it wasn't a logistical notice, it was a statement. A signal. A narrative bomb: the country is collapsing. The terrorists are winning. The Africans can't manage. No press conference needed. The panic would speak for itself. Evacuations. Embassies. International alerts. The storyline writes itself. Until someone breaks it. But this time, it didn't come from an army. It came from the French themselves, in Bamako. One by one, French citizens began filming. Speaking directly to the camera. Refusing to play along. We're safe. The streets are calm. This is our home. We're not leaving. They called it what it was, propaganda. They called out their own president. And suddenly, the silence had teeth. Because Goita didn't need to speak. He didn't need to refute. He let the story fall apart under its own contradictions. The panic script became a comedy. The withdrawal warning became a PR blunder. And for once, it wasn't Africa chasing rumors, it was Europe losing the plot. In Niamey, they watched closely. In Ouagadougou, they took notes. Because this wasn't just a tactical win, it was an information victory. A shift in tempo. A reminder that in the age of narrative warfare, restraint is power. The enemy expects a reaction. That's how they measure control. Panic equals confirmation. Outrage equals distraction. But stillness? Stillness is unpredictable. Stillness forces the world to fill in its own blanks, and sometimes the blanks reveal more than the headlines. The French media tried to walk it back. Tried to reframe. But the clips had gone viral. The faces were real. The accents undeniable. The message clear: we live here. You don't speak for us. And with that, a line was crossed. It wasn't just about Mali anymore. It was about who owns the narrative of danger. Who decides what is a threat, and to whom. For decades, African voices were background noise in their own stories. But now, even foreign citizens on African soil were challenging that hierarchy. Goita said nothing. But everything was said. And that, more than bullets, more than bases, more than borders, is what changed the war. Not with force. But with fracture. Soumpi was not a headline. It was a mirror. It showed us who still believes Africa must be saved, and who dares to believe Africa can save itself. They sent drones. We sent courage. They spun stories. We held the silence. They docked warships. We stood on dust and didn't move. This wasn't the end of a battle. It was the end of a pattern. Because what fell at Soumpi wasn't just a jihadist offensive. It was the assumption that Africans will always fall back. Always wait for help. Always accept the terms of their own erasure. But this time, Africa answered differently. If that answer speaks to you, if it lights something in your chest, then do more than watch. Like. Comment. Subscribe. And above all, stay loud. Stay clear. Stay committed. Because history is not written by the strong. It's written by the ones who refuse to stay silent. Now, it's our turn.